Well, thank you very much. One sign that you're old, I've listened to the previous talk about smartphones and so forth. When I grew up in Bingham Canyon, Utah, I remember the phone didn't even have a dial on it. It was just a phone with no dial. You picked it up, the town operator placed your call, and I remember my phone number for all of you. It's been my PIN code for many years, so if you want to break in, 424 was my phone number. So it shows that you're old. Another thing that shows you're old, I was on Greater Boston last night with Emily Rooney. And so before I went on, they put makeup on me, and it was great. And then I go on the set, and I hear somebody from the control booth says, "More makeup." So they come running out, put more makeup on me. We're almost ready to go, and another person says, "No, we got to have," and at that point, I told them, "Look, all the makeup and Revlon and L'Oreal and everything is not going to improve this mug." So I think they just went with what they got. But of course, another one of the signs of how old I am, and one of my proudest, is of the 50 years that UMass Boston has existed, I've been here 36 of them. So I appreciate this opportunity to celebrate with all of you. Believe it or not, I'm not going to talk very long. I know a lot of you are saying that's impossible, that Paul's not going to talk very long, but I am, because I want to. I hope we have an opportunity to hear from you, because what I really want to do is invite you to have a conversation. Let me begin with the near future. In the near future, one of the positions I hold is I am chairman of the U.S. Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee on Race, Ethnic, and Other Populations. And one of the things as part of that work and other work that I've done, that I've been trying to keep track of when the country is going to become a majority non-white country, indeed much like Boston became in the last few years. And we've been tracking this, and actually the current prediction is by the Census Bureau, it's even, the date is moving up and up almost every year, is 2043. So within a very short period of time, by the time UMass Boston certainly celebrates about the time it celebrates its 75th anniversary, this will become a majority non-white country. And for me, the question is, of course, other than just being interested in the statistics, is how will we as a country respond? How are we responding to this transformation, this important transformation that's taking place in our society? And particularly whites, for all the history of the country, have been the great majority within the United States. How are they going to respond to this important transformation? Let me also talk about the past. Indeed, maybe 50 years ago, since the founding of UMass Boston 50 years ago. It's also 50 years ago, as some of you I'm sure have noted, since the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. We were born in the same year that the Civil Rights Act was passed. And I was invited to a conversation a couple of weeks ago at Tufts University where there was a panel on the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. And the moderator asked this question: how far has America come in achieving the dream of racial equality 50 years after the Civil Rights Act? Now, partially to answer that question, I got to give you some context. At this same forum at Tufts University 50 years prior to that, last year, it was 50 years remembrance of the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's famous address on the Mall in Washington, D.C. And I made the point at that occasion last year that I thought too much of our attention on this important, momentous occasion, the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, focused on the latter part of the speech, really the small part of the speech. It was only about 20% of the speech, the so-called dream part of the speech. And the dream part of the speech is noble, and it's an aspiration, but it's it's the part of the speech that was widely embraced by people from the left and the right, Republicans, Democrats, black, white, and every color on the rainbow. And it's appropriate that it was, but what I thought was important is that so much less attention was paid to the other 80% of the speech. Because in the other 80% of the speech, Martin Luther King focused on what he called the shameful condition. And the shameful condition was the shameful condition people facing blacks and African Americans in the United States of America at the time of the speech in the 1960s. Now, after this long, hot summer of our discontent, from Ferguson and St. Louis and from Florida and Los Angeles, from Brooklyn, from the border on the Mexican-U.S. border, those shameful conditions, that shameful conditions continues to stare us in the face. In the past half century, have there been measures of progress? And have there been progress? Of course there have. Yes, they have. But how can we ignore these shameful conditions, the damning inequities that continue within our society here in October 2014? For example, on income, the black to white ratio in the advantage to blacks has remained unchanged in the 50 years since UMass Boston has existed. On unemployment, the black and white difference, that is greater black unemployment than whites, has not changed in the 50 years since UMass Boston has existed. In terms of wealth, whites have 20 times, think about this now, 20 times the wealth of blacks in the United States today. And that disparity is greater now in 2014 than it was 50 years ago. One of the aspects that I focused on in Ferguson was the militarization of the police, and that's a whole different story that we can have another tent talk on. But let's be clear about it. The militarization of the police is related to the so-called drug wars in the United States. And the so-called drug wars in the United States are related fundamentally to the issue of race. If you look, for example, at those SWAT teams with all of those powerful equipment and the face shields and all of the battering rams and so forth, and armaments that have been used, 80% of that equipment has not been used on terrorists, which would make you think that every little town in America has a terrorist lurking within it, but for serving warrants. 80% of that equipment and those SWAT teams have been used for raids for serving warrants. 2/3 of those have been for drug cases, and 70% of those have been issued against people of color. That's part of the war on drugs. One of the points that I just noticed, for example, in the city of Ferguson, the second leading source of revenue for the city of Ferguson, many of you picked it up, are fines that are collected for people who fail to appear in court. So of course you know the game. You arrest people who are poor and are needy, and you tell them to appear in court. They don't have representation, they don't know where to appear, so they don't show up to court, and then of course you fine them more. And it's the second leading source of revenue for the city of Ferguson. Incarceration rates. Today blacks have 6 times greater incarceration than whites, and the disparity now is greater than it was 50 years ago. I'm a political scientist. I study voting and participation in terms of felon disenfranchisement. So you know, in our country, we have in most jurisdictions, felons cannot vote. Indeed, in some jurisdictions, they can never vote. That is, if you've ever been a felon, you are permanently banned for life from voting. Well, what does this mean in terms of people of African American descent in the United States? 13% of African American males are disenfranchised because of felon disenfranchisement. What does that mean in terms of the African American vote in general? In 11 states in the United States, that means that at least, meaning more than 10% of all African American voters are denied the right to vote because of felon disenfranchisement. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote over 110 years ago that the problem, and he was writing at a turn of a different century, the problem of the 20th century is famously, as we know, the problem of the color line. That was true over 60 years ago when UMass Boston was established. And regrettably, it is true in my view in October 2014 and in the 21st century in which we reside. And it's not just the problem of the color line. If we follow the events, the horrific responses by many of our fellow citizens to those children coming up from Central America, it's the problem not just of the color line, but of the borderline as well. So let me sort of end with the question I began with. And the question was, how are we going to respond to these tremendous changes that have been taking place in our country and are going to be hitting us very soon within this country? Now, the fact is that I'm not hopeful about what is likely to happen. I am certainly not hopeful unless we make rapid progress addressing the nation's shameful conditions, the continuing shameful conditions, and the inequities, and ending the racial hierarchy that exists within our country and persists within our country. Now, if you think this sounds unreasonable, or if you think this sounds reasonable, let's not forget, for example, Representative Mo Brooks of Texas, on Fox News, consistently a commentator during the Ferguson situation, called those of us who raise these questions about the shameful condition as being responsible for a so-called war on whites. That in some ways it's our responsibility that we are by raising these questions, we are engaging in a war on whites. In Ferguson, right now, many people, including all of the members of the Ferguson Police Department, are wearing buttons. I think you've heard of this. And they say, "I am Darnell Wilson." I am Darnell Wilson. Darnell Wilson is the officer who shot Michael Brown. So the question is, what can be done? The beginning, in my view, of the end of racist violence, and again, the beginning of the end of the shameful condition, will be when more people stand up and assert with pride and solidarity that I am Michael Brown, I am Vincent Chin, I am Trayvon Martin, I am not illegal, I am not the Yellow Peril, I am not a Redskin even if I do play football in Washington, D.C. I am not a terrorist, I am somebody. Thank you.
Questions, comments? Yes, please.
Hi, very good to hear you. I saw this is more a comment. Excuse me. I saw a documentary on PBS once about the drug war, and one of the facts that I found very stunning was that it was, what was it? That the amount of jail time given for possession of crack cocaine is 20 times that of, let's say you had, an ounce of crack cocaine. You get 20 times more jail time than an ounce of powder cocaine. And a lot of people think that is kind of aimed towards blacks because black men are mostly caught with crack cocaine as opposed to powder cocaine, and powder cocaine is more popular in the suburbs. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. So,
well, you must have seen a documentary produced by UMass Boston, because that's exactly correct. That in fact there is a racial difference in terms of how cocaine is treated. One of the things, and actually one of the reasons why I'm a little upset that Eric Holder is stepping down. Eric Holder is actually making some progress on trying to get better sentencing on issues having to deal with cocaine. It was actually one of the things that he was really pushing hard for at the Department of Justice, and has made some progress. Irene.
Yes, please.
How can we educate our children so this can not continue to happen?
Boy, I wish the people in the audience would answer that question. Believe it or not, this sounds up for me. You know, I said to myself on Boston's Common, I'm not going to be too much of a downer, and I'm a bit of a downer because in answer to my own question, I'm not quite sure how it's going to go. I hope that we will embrace the difference and the change that's taking place within our country. In terms of the cultures and so forth, and the colors, and that we will embrace diversity without hierarchy. That we will embrace it without saying, I'm better than you because I'm Japanese, or I'm better than you because I'm Irish, but we embrace it. So diversity without hierarchy is what I hope that we will embrace. But I think there's strong resistance to this. And that's why I am so troubled. Ferguson was not a moment. I think that's the point of my talk. Ferguson was not a moment. This is the daily experience about being harassed in this fashion by young black men in our country. You cannot talk to a group of them, including students or anybody else, without hands going up in the air and say, this is the experience that I've had. So for me, what is the antidote to that? Well, I think in the near term, and it's not a very good answer, I really don't think so, that we have got to regulate the racial divide within the United States. I think we've got to find a way in which we don't hurt each other by doing this. And beyond that, we move to understanding. But the hope is your children is going to be my grandkids. And boy, we've got to teach them that fundamentally that they're all somebody.
Paul, thank you for
Thank
this great talk. UMass Boston is already there in the future that you projected for in whatever many years for the United States. What can we as a university project? How can we create a model of that country that is about to come into reality in a few years?
Well, I think part of that model is today's events. I wasn't able to attend all of them. I was meeting a class. I was teaching a class actually on the Japanese-American internment. Maybe that's even an example. I tell my students at the start of the term every year, I teach American foreign policy, and I says, look, there's probably 40,000 kids across the United States who's taken a class on the American foreign policy this September. I tell them there's probably 2 classes in the entire United States of America that are like you taking a class on the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. But what I'm saying is today's, and it's based on my understanding UMass Boston, today's part of the answer to your question. Look at the way we started our day. We have a chancellor, for example, one of the first African-American chancellors in any major university in the United States of America. Look at the array of faculty out there. We have one of the most diverse faculty, so they're the people who are placed in front of our students. And when I talked about what the United States is going to look like in 2040, that's about where UMass Boston is now. We're 40-something% people of color. So we both are an example, and we have a responsibility, it seems to me, and all of us, professors in particular, have a responsibility because they in some ways, those people in front of us are the parents of those kids who hopefully are going to take this message and improve upon the world which some of us have screwed up so badly during our lifetime.